Okay, everyone, so we're going to Broughton Island tonight, an island where lots of changes are happening, in particular associated with some of the management practices implemented in the last 10 or so years, in particular removal of feral animals. So I'll talk about that tonight, along with a general overview of the bird life of Broughton Island. What we're seeing here is a view that a sea eagle would see of the island as it flies each morning back from the mainland to spend the day on the island. There are actually a couple of other islands on this view. So around here is called Looking Glass Isle, and this at the back here is Little Broughton Island, but the bulk of this is Broughton Island. So what does the sea eagle see? It sees a relatively large island. It's hilly. A lot of vegetation. It's probably 90% or so of the island is vegetated, but generally quite low vegetation. So it's shrubs and it's grassland with just a few areas where there are taller trees, taller shrubs. Most of the coastline is cliff faces and rock platforms. So you can see around here and somewhere at the back and down this end. One long white sandy beach on the northern side of the island. This is north. This is known as Providence Beach. And there are a couple of smaller sandy coves, a couple around here on Esmeralda Cove. We'll see them in a video in a little while. Another one here at Coal Shaft. Okay, so that's what the sea eagle sees, and that's, I guess, what any bird will see when it flies towards Broughton Island. What I'm going to cover tonight is a very brief potted history of the island, and then we'll step through the various guilds of birds that occur on Broughton, and I'll talk about their status. There are, I guess, three particular stories I wanted to tell tonight along the way. One is the story of the Silvereyes, also the story of the nest boxes, the seabird nest boxes, and about change, what's changing. Some extra screens just popped up to distract me on my thing here. But so this is where Broughton Island is. So on the inset map here, you can see it's about 1/3 of the way between Port Stephens and Seal Rocks. It's actually not very far at all from the coast. So this closest point here, known as Dark Point, is only perhaps 3 kilometres. The island's only 3 kilometres offshore from Dark Point. It's very interesting to consider which bird species will move that 3 kilometre distance and which ones will never do so. On this main map shows a general outline of the island and Little Broughton alongside it. I always think this looks a bit like a cartoon, a caricature of a cartoon rocker. So here's his long legs, face and nose, and here's his big buffy Fonz type hairstyle. So that's something you can think about next time you're heading to Broughton Island. This on the northern side here is that big sandy beach that I showed in the earlier slide. Now we're going to start by showing a couple of videos of what it's like to arrive on Broughton Island. So the first will be coming in by boat. So the boat is going to pick up its journey from somewhere around where the cursor is here, just near Looking Glass Isle. Going to come up past this point around into Esmeralda Cove, and the boat actually heads off to the east for a while. We'll stop that video about that point, give you a bit of a view of some of the coastline and just a general impression of the island. And then we're going to arrive by helicopter, and the helicopter will fly over this area around here and land at a helicopter pad about here, and that'll show you what it's like from a different perspective. So let's start this by coming to Broughton. Doesn't seem to want to play. Let's Try this one more time and then we'll abandon the exercise. All right, neither of those, they were both working fine in the dry run, but they're not working now. This aerial view is good to just have a look at. So this is Esmeralda Cove, beautiful area with you know, scuba diving possibilities and stingrays around, etc. Two areas of beach. So this is Esmeralda Beach, where the fishing huts are, and the National Parks hut where we stay also here on the right hand side. And this is Little Poverty Beach, which is, you can just make out on this video some, these are wooden platforms here, and that's where, if you go to Broughton to camp, there are 3 camping areas that are wooden based, and also 2 grassy areas and a public toilet up there. All right, that's disappointing, that didn't work. So Broughton Island, a very long history of use by local tribes. Certainly just opposite Dark Point, the closest landfall. There are actually spear sharpening grooves in the rock platforms where they would sharpen their spears once they arrived. They obviously would have gone there for fishing, but in particular, when the shearwaters are breeding, it would have been an absolutely wonderful source of eggs and chicks and adult birds, very rich food for their diet. After European discovery, there were a couple of settlements for a time on the island, one being at Esmeralda Cove, where those huts are that I showed you earlier, and the other one up behind Providence Beach. And they lasted for a reasonable amount of time. There also was a research centre for rabbits for a few years. That led to the inevitable with escapees. And part of the history of Broughton Island has been a long period where feral plants and animals have been affecting the island. I guess the weeds are still quite a problem, but the feral animals, which included goats and cats, rats and rabbits, they've all been removed now. Also a very long history of fires, and a lot of that I've called lifestyle driven, because it was actually people wanting to go fishing and to get to their favourite spots. They found it convenient to just set a fire and burn down the bush, so it was a little bit easier to get to. So obviously huge impacts from both those feral animals and the frequent fires on Broughton Island. In 1972, it was incorporated into the Myre Lakes National Park, so taken into care for the first time and starting to be looked after. I think also some cultural changes started to happen slowly but steadily after incorporation into the national park. 2009, the rats and rabbits were removed, so the island is now officially feral animal free. A couple of years after that, started talking, HBSC and National Parks and Wildlife Service started talking, and they already had plans to monitor the changes to seabird populations after removal of the feral animals. But we also then started a study of the terrestrial birds and the impacts, what happened to them. So the first phase of that was 5 years of visits twice a year in spring and autumn. And that basically allowed us to develop a baseline of data of what the island was like before the changes started to become serious. We'll talk about what the changes are later. And then since mid-2017, we've moved to a combination of quarterly bird surveys and a banding study. So quarterly visits for surveys and banding. And that 2-pronged approach of the surveys plus banding has actually been very effective in giving us wonderful insights about what's happening on the island. So I'm going to step through the birds and I guess first and foremost, Broughton Island is a seabird island. We're doing a lot of work on the land birds, but it is a seabird island, and shearwaters in particular dominate, with wedge-tailed shearwaters. They're in massive numbers. So in the breeding season, they're just all over the place. A survey in 2009 estimated 55,000 pairs were present. That was plus or minus quite a bit. A follow-up survey done last year. I don't actually have the exact numbers, but the feedback has been that the numbers have actually increased from 55,000 pairs, which is already a massive number. So shearwaters everywhere. Some of the photos here, I should mention that all the photos that I'm showing tonight are my own, except where I have acknowledged them from as being from someone else. So in the breeding season, you see this sight a lot of shearwaters at night sitting outside their burrows. And towards the end of the breeding season, you see this sad sight, quite a few chicks that aren't going to make it. Their parents have already left for their migration and they haven't finished molting into adult plumage yet, and basically they're just fodder for whistling kites and sea eagles and that sort of thing. There are also short-tailed shearwaters on Broughton Island. The 2009 surveys found roughly 200 to 300 pairs. That's quite a decrease from studies in the mid-1970s by Bill Lane, who probably got, I think, around 1,500 or so pairs. There still are short-tailed shearwaters on the island breeding, but my theory is that they're not succeeding in the competition with the wedge-tailed shearwaters, which are just dominating. Other seabirds on the island, firstly little penguins. So there are, from the 2009 study, there are 3 to 4 dozen pairs that come ashore mostly on the northwest side of the island in 5 different landing sites. There's only one that's easy to get to, so in summertime we usually go down one evening and watch them come ashore. There's about maybe 10 birds that come ashore there. Also, Gould's Petrel breeds on Broughton Island. So in 2009, in the surveys, they found a bird sitting on an egg in scree at the bottom of Pinkertop, the highest part of the island. So that was the first indication that Gould's Petrels were breeding on the island. The following year, adult birds were heard on Little Broughton Island, so it's really only 50 metres away from where the bird on egg was. That was those 2 data points were a motivator in the eventual installation of the artificial nest boxes. We'll hear more about them later, but Gould's Petrels are certainly breeding on Broughton Island. White-faced storm petrels are not, but in the early 20th century, when a guy called Bassett Hull visited the island, he reported that they were there in thousands of pairs. The last records are from the 1930s. They're believed to have gone extinct from rats, which got onto the island about 1935. So now that the rats have gone, the expectation or the hope is that white-faced storm petrels will come back. They don't have to come from very far because there are nearby islands where they do breed. So it's just a matter of them rediscovering Broughton Island and how long that takes. So there are also records from Bill Lane in the 1970s of sooty shearwaters breeding on Broughton Island. That's very old and certainly not current. But anyway, so an important seabird island, and I guess there's sort of like 60 or 70,000 pairs of seabirds breed on Broughton Island each year, the majority of which are wedge-tailed shearwaters. Onto other gills, and firstly shorebirds. So the main shorebird on Broughton Island is the sooty oystercatcher, and from Lois Wooding's paper in the 2019 Whistler, we know that Broughton Island is one of the most important sites for sooty oystercatcher in the Hunter region. We find 25 to 35 birds every visit. There are several breeding pairs, 3 pairs that we know of, but there are also lots of parts of the island that it's very difficult to get to, and they'd be prime candidates for where an oystercatcher might breed around rocky shorelines, rock platforms, that sort of thing. So always lots of sooty oystercatchers. We also find red-capped plovers every visit. I think the highest count's been 8 birds. It's more typically 4 or so. They probably are breeding there every year. There's only one known breeding record, and that's from about 10 years ago. But our surveys quite possibly are not quite at the right time to find the redcaps breeding. I suspect they do breed there all the time. Certainly there's always a couple of pairs of them on the beach, primarily on Providence Beach. Other birds do turn up, other shorebirds, pied oyster catchers from time to time, and they actually have attempted to breed. A pair had a nest with eggs, but we don't know what happened with that breeding attempt. That was about 8 or 9 years ago. And I guess one of the issues about studying birds on Broughton Island is you can only get there every once in a while, and you're not really sure what happens from the time that you go away to the time that you come back. Also, particularly in migration period, get ruddy turnstones and double-banded plovers drop in sometimes. But that's kind of it for shorebirds as a general rule. It doesn't have mudflats on the island, so you don't get the godwits and the curlews, that kind of thing. That was it for shorebirds until our last visit, when we had a great surprise and we found a pair of beach stone curlew that we actually found them on Little Poverty Beach, just near the huts. But all the signs were, based on footprints, that they were actually going around each morning as the tide dropped to feed on Providence Beach. There were footprints all over the place, but it was very windy at the time on Providence Beach, so I think they were coming to Little Poverty to escape the wind. So that was very exciting. It's a critically endangered species, so it's always good to have records of them, and they were certainly the first known records for Broughton Island. Almost certainly they are progeny stemming from the various other breeding pairs that we have locally. There's been a pair at Old Bar for a long time, another one or possibly even 2 pairs breeding in Port Stephens. So there's been very good breeding success locally for beachstone curlew, and some birds are now turned up on Broughton Island. We're hoping that's the start of something, but obviously we don't know because we can't get back there to check. National Park staff have been on the lookout. They have not seen the birds on Little Poverty Beach in recent visits, but I guess they're doing, the staff are doing tasks, so they're not having a lot of time to look, and they're not looking on Providence Beach, which is where I think the birds are more likely to be. So very intriguing. Okay, on to other birds, and firstly gulls and terns. So both silver gulls and greater crested terns have quite sizable breeding colonies on the southern, southwestern side of the island around Looking Glass Bay. It's actually quite close to where the ospreys nest, and I do wonder whether the ospreys are giving them some protection from marauding ravens and that kind of thing. So quite large colonies of the order of 100 or so pairs. But also for silver gulls, there's a smaller colony just right at the huts itself. There's a point there, rocky ledges, etc., and there's another 5 or 10 pairs that breed there. And that's very convenient for them for scavenging, because they can just drop down to the huts and get all the fish entrails and other things that people leave behind. So there's a silver gull chick from some of the colony near the huts, and this photo from Neil Fraser shows one of the crested tern chicks living in a not very pleasant environment, surrounded by guano, but I think a lot of it was old guano. Now, there's a couple of special water birds on Broughton Island. The first of them is the reef egret. So we record reef egrets all the time on the island, and there quite possibly are 6 birds around. It's obviously very hard. They all look the same, but we see them all over the place, and there have been plenty of records that suggest that there's certainly at least 4 and quite possibly more than 4 birds there. More recent development is that probably evidence that they are breeding on Broughton Island, which I guess is not a surprise given the numbers and the habitat being correct. But what happened is that we found an old nest of something, but right alongside it was a reef egret feather in a cave where we had seen birds going to regularly in that particular visit. In June, we were able to get over there and install some cameras, And it's obviously not the breeding season, but we've had some interesting developments already with occasional visits, including this particular visit here where you see there's 2 reef egrets, and it's a little bit harder now to make out in this image this size and a little bit not quite focused. But this bird here is handing to the other bird a tuft of grass as some sort of courtship thing. So we're very hopeful that in the coming months that we'll actually find evidence that they are breeding on the island. And that's exciting because there's actually only one ever confirmed breeding record for the Hunter region for reef egret, and that dates from 1910. So it'd be nice to get a 21st century breeding record for them. Now, the other special water birds for Broughton Island are the rails. And when we started the surveys in 2012, it was a revelation to discover that Lewin's rails are actually quite common on Broughton Island. No one had recognised that previously, but there are actually quite a few of them there. They're obviously heard more often than seen, but we do get sightings of them. There are at least several birds, and they're very wide ranging, so we find them all over the island, even up at the highest point, Pinkertop, 90 something metres altitude. We've heard Lewin's rails calling up there, and virtually every visit we get at least 1 or 2 different birds heard around the island. So it's quite a hotspot for Lewin's rails. It's also quite common to get buff-banded rails there. They do seem to be less common than the Lewin's rails, which is not often you hear that statement in a sentence. But it could also be that they're just a bit less, a bit more silent or harder to pick up from a distance. Anyway, we certainly get them on many visits. There is a known breeding record for them as well, where there was an adult with chicks seen. So some pretty special water birds on the island. Other water birds there are, I guess, the 2 big cormorants, the great cormorant and the great pied cormorant. Quite common to get 30 or so birds present, and then lesser numbers of other things like the 2 other cormorants and darters and gannets in the winter months coming right inshore to feed, like in the middle of Esmeralda Cove, for example. Now, I said earlier that Broughton Island is a seabird island, but it's also a raptor island. It's just about, you just about never go more than a minute without looking up and seeing a bird of prey somewhere up in the sky. I guess there's not a lot of canopy, so you do have much greater visibility, but we see birds of prey all the time. There's been 12 different species recorded since 2012. I won't go through them all, but I'll certainly mention several of them. Sea eagles are the most common, and there are 4 to 6 birds around. You can tell because there's immatures as well as adults in different stages of development, and they seem to come across from the mainland in the morning and go back at night. Also ospreys, see them all the time. They actually breed on Broughton Island now, and what we've got here actually is a bird that was banded at its nest in December last year, and this photograph was taken in June, so that bird was still hanging around the island. We've actually seen 8 birds all on separate roosts around Looking Glass Bay, which is not very far from the nest. So it's interesting to try and understand how 8 birds can be there so close to a nest, an active nest. Presumably it's the parents, the breeding pair, and some of the young offspring, but maybe all of the offspring hang around for several years, but certainly 8 birds have been counted in that area. We also get whistling kites and swamp harriers very regularly, just in small numbers, so a couple of whistling kites seem to be there all the time, and similarly for swamp harriers. There are old breeding records for swamp harriers, but we haven't managed to find them breeding since we started doing the regular surveys. Black-shouldered kite and peregrine falcons, just 1 or 2 of those, seen quite frequently. And a more recent development has been to get brown falcons and brown goshawks. So they never used to be recorded, but In recent years, we are seeing them. We've actually, from the banding study, we know that there are at least 3 different brown goshawks on Broughton Island where we were just not recording them at all. And we'll talk later about why those 2 particular species are there. The other interesting bird of prey to mention, we were stunned in 2013 when we were there in autumn to see a spotted harrier, and we saw it, we were there 3 days, we saw it daily. And then the same thing happened in 2014, spotted harriers on Broughton Island. It just seemed amazing. When I was preparing this talk and digging through older data, I also found there was an autumn 2009 record. So it certainly apparently is not uncommon for spotted harriers, if they're coming in, if there's an eruption and they're coming all the way down to the lower Hunter estuary, for some to continue on and end up on Broughton Island. Quite interesting. Now, terrestrial birds, there's actually not a lot of them on Broughton Island. This is a list of all of the main ones. So there's 5 that are very common and 5 that are less common. And then the rest they're a mixture of vagrants and new arrivals in small numbers. So these birds are present in larger numbers. The first 5 here are quite substantial numbers. The other birds ranging from 1s and 2s to maybe 10 or so for yellow-faced honeyeaters on any visit. I'll talk about the silvereyes coming up, but a thing that intrigues me are the brown quail on Broughton Island. I have a theory that this is the Broughton Island subspecies of brown quail. I can't prove that because I have almost no information. However, Broughton Island has been isolated from the mainland for tens of thousands of years, or thousands of years at least. And I'm not sure why a brown quail would leave Broughton Island. So I think these birds have been on the island for a very, very long time and probably not interbreeding with other brown quail. I certainly would like to know more about them and to see whether indeed they do stay on the island or perhaps they move to the mainland and back again. We don't know, but it's interesting to think about them as being the Broughton Island brown quail. Now, on to silvereyes. So firstly, in our region, we have 3 subspecies of silvereye as possibilities. So the ones that we call local birds, Cornwallie, occupants of Queensland and northern New South Wales, very bright yellow throat on these birds, and the sides on their flanks, just a very, very palely coloured bird. Then you have 2 other subspecies, westernensis, which occurs in Victoria and southern New South Wales, and lateralis, which is a bird that breeds in Tasmania. Lateralis has an all-grey throat and quite deeply buff-coloured flanks. You can see from this photo. Westernensis is somewhere in between. So the throat is pale yellow. If you actually look at the throat with the bird in the hand, it's a mixture of grey feathers and yellow feathers, giving that pale colour. And the flanks are quite buff, but they're not as deeply buffed as the lateralis birds. However, if you haven't got the bird in the hand, and silvereyes move around a lot of times people see buff flanks and say they've got a Tasmanian bird. The reality is what they probably have seen is the westernensis bird, but they may have seen a lateralis. They do come here. We'll see some data about that shortly. So what happens on Broughton Island? Silvereyes have become a lot more common on the island than they were when we first started doing the surveys. So we used to think there were maybe 50 or so on the island. Perhaps we were a bit naive in our estimations, but it's clear that the numbers have gone up considerably. Since the banding study, there's actually been about 550 silvereyes banded on Broughton Island. Right? So that's massive numbers. And through that banding study, we're actually getting now a pretty good handle about some of the things that happen with silvereyes on Broughton Island. So there's a core population of the Cornwallie birds, the local ones with the bright yellow throat. They could be considered resident. They certainly are regularly visiting, and because we can only get there every 3 months, we can't really tell the difference between those two, but there are Cornwallis birds on Broughton Island all the time in lesser numbers. But then there are two annual influxes. So in autumn, the southern birds start to arrive, the westernensis and lateralis. And those birds stick around for almost 6 months. So through autumn and winter, we've got the local Cornwallis birds supplemented by these southern birds that have come to visit. And then there's another influx in spring, which is of Cornwallis birds. So the numbers really go up substantially. And that's linked mainly to the fruiting of a plant called the tree broomheath, or Monotoca elliptica, which is now quite prolific, and it produces these huge stands of berries, which when they're ripe turn into an orangey red colour. There's a mixture on this photo of ripe and not ripe berries. You can, in spring, when the silvereye is first caught, it's put into a bag, a linen bag, until it's processed. The number of bags that we see that are stained with the berry juice from this Monotoca is just amazing. They're just feasting on it all the time. There's two influxes happening. The Cornwallis birds, in fact, we see with them that we actually get records of birds in spring returning the following spring, so they come regularly. As of yet, we have no records of any of these southern birds, the westernensis and lateralis, returning to Broughton Island. So they might be there for the whole season, autumn and winter. We'll get a retrap bird in the winter when it was banded in autumn, but we don't see that bird again. But we do see the Cornwallis birds all the time, or regularly. So in autumn and winter, when we've got the three subspecies, what we find is that the ratios are approximately constant. That's, a rubbery number, but roughly 15% of the birds we catch are the lateralis birds, the ones from Tasmania, and the other two subspecies, it's roughly equal numbers of them. So it's about 40 to 45% of each of the other two species. Seen that pattern over 3 autumn and winter visits. When we retrap birds in a different year, it is only the local birds, only the Cornwallis birds. They seem to have a retained memory of knowing to go to Broughton Island when the conditions are good, but the other birds perhaps don't always make it up to our part of the world. Very interesting thing. So we measure the biometrics of all the birds that are caught in the nets, and this is the first time that there's actually been an opportunity to have a comparison study of the 3 subspecies by the same people using the same techniques, the same rules, etc. Not doing it on live birds, not using specimens. What we found is, look at these graphs here. So in things like the weight, the wing length, and the head-bill length, all 3 subspecies are pretty much the same sort of measurements. So this is bird's weight, head length, head bill, and wing length. But for the tail length, very intriguing. So this is the westernensis here, and there is a statistically significant difference in the length of their tail. So although some of them have tails that are that overlap, it's very clear that birds with tails of over, say, 46 mils are actually westernensis birds, and no Cornwallis or lateralis birds that we found have ever had such long tails. Why that would be so, I've got no theory. If I was going to predict anything, I would have predicted that the wing length on birds that migrate would be longer, but that's not the case. But the westernensis birds have longer tails. So that was in autumn, winter. In spring, just about all the birds that we get there are Cornwallis, but a small number of westernensis birds still there. They're all gone by summer, so we interpret that as being birds that are just a bit late departing. Now onto the nest boxes. So the 2016 Twitchathon, the funds were raised and used to install some artificial nest boxes on Broughton Island. They're on Pinkertop, which is the highest point. which is on the eastern end of the eastern side of the island, directly facing Little Broughton Island. There were 6 Gould's Petrel nest boxes put in, and not far away 9 nest boxes for white-faced storm petrels. And for each of those 2 systems, there are dedicated call playback systems that play calls of those birds, at night. Now, so what we can see in these 2 images, firstly this one here, this little patch of artificial lawn is the roof of a white-faced storm petrel nest box. It's just a little round dome thing that nothing bigger than a white-faced storm petrel could fit into. So in other words, the bigger petrels can't use this. And so that's the nest box. Here is the entry burrow for this particular nest. It's a tube of black poly pipe. And there's a distance of maybe half a metre, maybe not quite that long, that the bird has to go to get to the burrow. So I guess that's going to stop any other critter from being tempted to go in there. But for the storm petrels, that they're happy with that journey. That's a typical sort of thing that they would do with the burrows that they make themselves, or which they find as natural burrows. So there are 9 of these all scattered around in this particular area. On this side, here are 2 Gould's Petrel nest boxes, and this is the speaker system for the call playback. So that's basically facing out to sea, and there's an equivalent one over here for the storm petrels. And as soon as it gets dark, that activates and starts playing their calls all night, every night, to lure birds in. These are the nest boxes, so you can't see burrows in this, but this nest box here, the entry burrow is just down here. So again, the bird would have to come up through some polypipe and then get into this arrangement here. Most of this is of no importance or value, so this is just empty. There's a lid and then sort of an empty box and a floor, which is actually the roof of the cavity. So when you open this up to see if anything's in it, you take off the lid and then you reach in, lift up the floor of this part of the box, and that exposes the cavity beneath, and you hope that you'll find a Gould's petrel, and sometimes you do. I still don't know why their nest boxes are designed like that, but that's what they look like. Now, so what's happened with them? So with the storm petrels, 2 years ago, I found a feather in one nest box, but that's been the only development so far on that front. So no signs of any further use by storm petrels on their particular nest boxes. But for the Gould's petrels, it's been a different story, and it's been very successful. So the first Gould's petrel arrived in December 2018, another one not long afterwards. So there were 2 birds found at different times in the same nest box in 2018. There has to date been 7 individual birds confirmed to have visited nest boxes. That's quite possibly an underestimate, because it's really only every now and then that somebody is able to get up there and check the nest boxes, and that's just a matter of luck then as to whether there's a bird in there or not, particularly if they're just coming in an exploratory visit. But definitely 7 birds have visited. They've been banded, so we know how to tell one from the other. And then in 2019, Greg Little and I found an egg in one of the nest boxes. It was actually the nest box where these 2 birds up here had been found. Found an egg. We were beside ourselves with joy, and that egg successfully hatched, and the bird was raised and fledged in April 2020, April this year. So the parents of that chick were the birds that have been visiting since 2018. It's like they took a year to get familiar with the nest box and with each other, and then they're underway. Here's Suzanne and myself holding the little chick. There's a second nest box there, so there are 6 nest boxes, but there's a second one which has now had 2 different birds visit. Are they a pair? well, we don't know yet, but it's sort of showing the same pattern as with these first two birds. So we've got two birds coming to a second nest box. Fingers crossed that some things start to happen with them as well. And there's 4 other nest boxes that they can use. Okay, so that's been very successful. It also led to a really surprising development, and that's in October last year, there was a Pycroft petrel in one of the nest boxes. It actually was sharing a nest box with the Gould's petrel. It was just amazing. It was Tom Clark and myself up there, and our jaws dropped when we opened up this particular nest box and found these 2 birds. This is the Gould's petrel, a much darker bird and actually also larger, and this is the Pycroft's petrel. Tom and I at the time didn't really know what to make of that. We knew we were onto something, but just exactly what it was. We took lots of photos, sent them to various people. Mick Roderick was onto it pretty quickly that it seemed to be a Pycroft petrel. We actually were able to go back the next day and take some banding gear, like rulers and so forth, so we could weigh the bird and get some biometrics on it. All of that information we were able to collect was this formed a submission to BARC, the Rarities Committee, and just recently, like in this past few days, got the word that the record has been accepted, and it's actually the first Pycroft petrel in modern times for the Australian list. So very interesting. What was it doing in a nest box and for 2 days? So maybe it's a sign of things to come, that perhaps Pycroft petrels might start to breed on Broughton Island. It's wonderful to think of that as a possibility, but we won't know until we make more visits and are able to see what's happening. Hopefully it is a sign of things to come. Now, there was only 10 birds on my slide of land birds, but there's another 25 roughly birds that have turned up since 2012 for brief visits. Most of those, mostly for brief visits. There's been some that have stayed, but this is those visits have been brief, and they're sort of still treated as vagrants. That's actually the mechanism how we're going to get recolonisations or new colonisations on Broughton Island. So birds will turn up and they'll find it to their liking, and they'll avoid predators, and eventually they'll settle. However, mostly what we've had so far have been nomadic and migratory species. So birds, in other words, that are never likely to stay for very long. Some interesting visitors. So forest ravens we've had. The nearest colony of them is over near Seal Rocks. So a group of them made a journey one day, or for a brief period. There was a time when we had 4 Horsfield's bronze cuckoos on the island at the one time. It coincided with an eruption of Horsfield's bronze cuckoos into the region. We had an eastern yellow robin winter last year. Yellow robins, if you read Hansab, their average dispersal distance is about 500 metres. But this particular bird that turned up, it's not this bird, actually it's just a photo I grabbed, but this particular bird has certainly dispersed a lot more than 500 metres to get to Broughton Island. And a couple of others that have in more recent times spotted pardalote and rose robin in the most recent visit. However, the pardalote and the rose robin are known birds that move around, migrate or nomadic, migratory, I guess. So perhaps that's not so much of a surprise. But what is changing then? So I guess the main thing is that the vegetation is changing. So what we're seeing is that shrubs are replacing grasses in sheltered areas. So wherever there's windy areas and exposed to salt, I don't think that's going to happen, but the shrubs replacing grasses. The shrubs are becoming taller. There's more coastal banksia. There used to be just really one quite large banksia tree full of flowers a lot of the time, but there's now several more of them springing up. Because of those changes, we're certainly seeing there's a couple of species that we now consider resident or regularly visiting. We can't tell the difference, but little wattlebirds are always hanging around that big banksia that I was mentioning. yellow-faced honeyeaters mostly hang around that same area, but they have actually dispersed over many other parts of the island where there are substantial shrubs present. We've actually banded 19 different yellow-faced honeyeaters, and we only get maybe 1/3 of the birds are retraps. So there are new birds coming to the island quite regularly. So we consider those two species to be resident, as in they're all the time, and they're quite obvious and in numbers, there are certainly at least one pair and even a couple of pairs. 4 other new arrivals, the 2 raptors that I talked about, the brown goshawk and the brown falcon, and then 2 passerines, grey fantail and golden whistler. So both the whistler and the fantail, we're now seeing, we've now got more than one bird on the island. And so that seems to me that is the first steps towards a repopulation or a colonisation of Broughton Island with habitat that's now suitable for these birds. Also, there's a substantial change in terms of the increase in silvereye numbers. I think the reason why we're seeing now brown goshawk and brown falcon all the time, and at least 3 brown goshawks, is because the silvereyes and these other birds, other passerines, the honeyeaters, etc., have increased in such numbers that there's just so much more food around for those birds. But there are also, there's winners and losers and everything. Pretty good evidence that golden-headed cisticolas are in decline. So this graph here shows basically the reporting rates from our 2-hectare sites in the first 5 years of the study and in the most recent 3 years. And there's quite a decline in the reporting rates for across those 2 time periods. The decline is statistically significant, and particularly around 4 of our 6 2-hectare sites, which are just about got no grassland in them anymore. There's also some evidence that the grassbirds and cuckoos may be declining, but the grassbirds seem to be able to use the shrubs still, so not quite so badly affected. Cuckoos probably are declining, but their decline, which is a real decline across the 2 time periods, also coincided with dry conditions. And our most recent visit, we actually had cuckoos that we had not been getting in the previous couple of years. So maybe they just don't like the dry conditions. So just to conclude, for seabirds, the island's importance just continues and is growing. Gould's petrels are coming regularly. I think we can expect the breeding numbers to expand from 1 pair to, who knows, 2, 3 pairs. Hopefully all 6 nest boxes eventually. We're hanging out for when the white-faced storm petrels return. There are a couple of reports of people seeing what probably were white-faced storm petrels flying overhead, but we haven't got anything more than that. And I think, given we've got a Pycroft petrel, and we've had, past records of things like bullers, shearwaters and sooty shearwaters, we've just got to expect the unexpected in terms of what other seabirds might start to use the island. For the coastal and water birds, their habitat hasn't changed, and so you wouldn't expect any change for those guilds of birds, and that seems to be the case. It's pretty much steady state. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the beachstone curlews, though, and particularly if they're trying to be on Broughton Island when the visitor numbers go up as the days warm up. Birds of prey, there's lots of them on Broughton Island. 2 new arrivals, and those 2 are probably linked with the increasing numbers of passerines. Terrestrial birds, we've got 4 new arrivals, lots and lots of silvereyes, and some grassland species in decline as a result of the changes. And kind of just waiting to see what happens next in terms of what arrives. Look forward to the next few years of the regular visits. Just want to conclude by firstly thanking the ranger for Broughton Island, Suzanne Callaghan. That's Sue's over here, posing in front of the team from October last year. Her support has just been fantastic and has made the whole study go so smoothly. There's at least 25 people, members of HBSC, who have participated, some as day visitors, some for 3-day excursions. Also the banders, led by Greg Little and Judy, and also Rob Kite as part of the core team, but plenty of others have come along, and it's just amazing to watch them and their knowledge. Jeff and Mez Pettifer, particularly, I guess, in the early years, use of your hut, that was fantastic, and lots of help with general information. And my daughter Robin for help with the statistics. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Amazing. I personally think it's one of the most exciting things that's happening in the Hunter. We all know that things happen quickly on islands. It's a great place to do work, and having Broughton and our other islands pest-free is really exciting. And I think expecting the unexpected is a good way of putting it. Are there any questions or comments? Thanks, Sue.
Is this all right?
Yeah, Graham, is it?
Oh, well, first of all, Alan, such a brilliant presentation and great teamwork by the club. Congratulations to you all.
Thanks, Graham.
And the second thing, unfortunately, because we missed the flyover of the island, I'm still trying to grapple with its attractive sides. So where do the prevailing winds come from? Are they northeasterlies like they are here? Or, I mean, where will most of the birds be located?
Sorry, where are they located?
Yeah, where will we find them? Where's the sheltered side of the island? Is it south or is it the north?
The most sheltered side is towards the north in the centre, which is where things like the Banksias and the Monotocca mostly are found. So when you get to the eastern and the southern sides, that still is mostly grasslands and quite windswept, and you know, what vegetation that's not grass is quite stunted sort of stuff in the main. But in that central northern part of the island, that's much more sheltered, and that's where we're finding the Honeyeaters and the Fantails and the golden whistlers, etc.
Yeah. Look, just one other question about the habitat, if you don't mind. It's sort of intriguing to see that only the coastal Banksia seem to be the dominant shrub, if you like, although they do tend to end up as trees, as canopy. But are there any others that would attract other nectar-eating or other species, do you think?
I probably will hand over to Greg Little now, if Greg would like to jump in. But there's the Monotocca, and there are certainly other things there. And there's corkwood. There's a huge stand of corkwood somewhere. So there are other things.
There's a fig tree, and the big fig tree in the middle of the island that Rob and I walked out to one day. But that's the only one. There's not a lot of other fruiting trees out there, or flowering trees other than the Banksia and the Monotocca.
And some wattle.
The corkwoods there, but I don't know that it fruits or flowers much for the birds.
Okay, so they're sort of 2 metre high trees, aren't they?
Yeah, 2 or 3 metre high trees.
Yeah. Okay.
Very hard working on Broughton Island in summertime because there's almost no shade most of where you have to
go.
Al?
Yep.
Is there any activity on Storm Petrel Reserve, West Rock?
Not by HBOC, Jeff. I'm not sure whether Suzanne managed to dial in or not, but I don't know whether they went to places like that over to those islands as part of the 2019 surveys, or whether they only surveyed Broughton Island. I don't know.
Okay, then I take it there's no nothing done on Little Broughton Island?
There's nothing done currently, but there's plans in this coming summer to do some things. I think Emily Mowatt's got a job to wander around Little Broughton with video cameras and song meters and all sorts of things. So something will be happening in this coming summer. I don't envy her because, look, it's really hard walking around Broughton Island, and there are some rudimentary tracks
That's good.
there, but on Little Broughton, there's just nothing. It would be such hard work. But
Should be looking for volunteers, Alan.
Right.
I'm not volunteering, Mick.
Yeah, that'll be happening.
Sounds all right.
Yeah, I reckon it sounds brilliant.
Even getting onto Little Broughton Island would have its challenges.
Alan, can you answer that question there from Sue Gould? Who did she contact to help out as a volunteer? Probably yourself?
That's it. But I also need to say that it's not easy to become a volunteer on Broughton Island in that numbers are limited. We stay in the National Park hut, which limits things. And with COVID, there's even greater limits. We've also got to always have some banders as well as surveyors. And I guess a track record of helping HBOC with surveys or banding puts you sort of higher to the head of the queue than otherwise. But we're very limited on numbers, so that makes it very difficult.
Yeah.
There'll be occasions when there'll be a hut available, though, Alan? Times?
Yeah, I don't. Well, you know more about the huts and availability, Jeff, than I do. I guess the National Parks hut is really only for people who are doing, like organised programs. So,
Yeah, that's right.
So I guess I'm not able really to give advice. But for anyone who would just like to go and have a look at Broughton Island, and that's a great experience. From November to April, there are boat trips twice a week on MV Moonshadow, which gets you out there and a few hours to walk around the island and at least understand some of its magic.
Yeah, it's the only place in Australia you can camp amongst an active seabird breeding colony.
I remember the very first breeding season when we were out there to do our surveys, and I guess that was 2012, the spring surveys. There was a whole crew of National Parks people came out to do various tasks, and a couple of the staff were going to camp on the platforms in their tents. They went off as happy as Larry because you got magnificent views and it's just wonderful. And they came back in the morning, they're absolute dead wrecks because they'd spent the whole night without sleep. Shearwaters kept crashing into the tents, hitting the wooden floors, and shearwaters can't walk very well at the best of times, so they were just scrambling over the wooden floors the whole time. These guys were searching for earplugs for the second night.
Neil doesn't recommend it. Okay, maybe it's New South Wales.
Calls at night time can be eerie.
They have a very eerie call, so that also keeps you awake.
Thanks for clarifying that. So yeah, maybe it's just the only place in New South Wales you can camp in an active seabird breeding colony. But just a comment on the seabirds and Alan's expect the unexpected and the surprising visit from a Pycroft's petrel. So Pycroft's petrels, because of the amazing work that the New Zealanders have done, like they're 15 to 20 years ahead of us in eradicating pests on their breeding islands. So Pycroft's petrels have almost reached capacity on their island. So they're prospecting other places to breed. And that's, I think, partly explains why we had a bird on Broughton. But also with the rats now off Lord Howe, it's possible that they might return to breed there. So yeah, it's actually literally about a fortnight away from the time of year that the bird was found last year. When will the nest boxes be checked next? Do you know, Alan?
We're hoping to get over in late October.
So about the same time.
It'll be similar time, yeah. But we're also, I've organised 4 cameras, so we're going to set up cameras on the nest boxes as
That's
well.
good. Yeah, I actually
Because,
asked
we just
Sue
don't know what, we'll be there for a day or two, and then something might turn up the next day, and we won't know.
No, cameras is the best idea. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Well, we'll see. We probably won't be able to. It might be a struggle. Birds coming in at night, it might be a struggle to identify them, etc. But at least we'll have some idea.
Yeah.
A better idea.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments for Alan? Greg?
Is it possible that if we found one Pycroft on Broughton Island, is it possible other Pycroft petrels have visited the other islands like Cabbage Tree and Brindlebar and that sort of thing? Is it possible that's happened?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think there was a black-winged petrel was heard on Cabbage Tree last summer. Mick,
there's been a few, like over a few seasons. So black-winged petrels are actually colonising many islands in the Pacific. Like they weren't on Phillip Island until, I don't know what it was, 30 years ago or something. Now there's 5,000 pairs or whatever it is. So black-winged petrels are actively seeking other islands to breed on. And so, yeah, there have been a few pairs recorded on Cabbage Tree. Potentially they could turn up on Broughton. I don't know. It just might be the wrong habitat for them. So it does really boil down to habitat. But I mean, if another Pycroft's petrel, so presumably that bird was, calling out, hoping that a mate would join her, even though it had a Gould's petrel sitting next to it. But if another Pycroft happens to be passing and joins it, I mean, that's how colonisation starts.
Exactly.
It's pretty exciting stuff.
It could also be a one-off.
No, that's right. But getting pests off islands is just really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, there's the buller shearwater that was on. There were, I think, a few records of a few seasons of a buller shearwater, and then that was presumably just one bird that was kept coming through.
Yeah,
so,
that happens too. Yeah.
Yep.
Got a question?
Liz?
Is there vegetation monitoring and any active management of the weeds and maybe some re-veg happening?
There's certainly vegetation monitoring, and the likes of Tom Clark are involved in that. So they've got transects and so forth where they check things regularly, and photo points, etc. There's also weed control, spraying, for example. It gets done from time to time. Prickly pear is one of the weeds, one of the many weeds. There's been some attempts to get biological controls happening. They haven't worked very well. None of it works really well. It's pretty tough conditions. The wind keeps blowing stuff away, and the salt spray, and whatever. So I'm not sure you could say they're winning the battle against weeds, but they're trying on things. One of the issues is actually not a lot of funding for weed control, and that's partly because there's no evidence that the weeds are having any impact on any of the species, like the shearwaters, for example. In fact, it's the other way around. The biggest colonies of prickly pear are where the shearwater colonies are, because they disturb the earth and sort of aerate it, and also all their droppings fertilise it. So it's just great for prickly pear. Anyhow, with things like Gould's petrels and other threatened species on the island, beachstone curlers maybe, that might maybe free up some other avenues for finding funds, which would be great.
Well, on that note, so Alan mentioned that the nest boxes were funded out of the 2016 Twitchathon funding, and there is still a few remnant $1,000 in that kitty that Sue's, I think, has plans for, to do some weed control. There's some Dolichos P on the island. I think might be around the June where white-faced storm petrels were thought to have bred on the main island. So So, you know, Twitchathon money could go to another really useful cause on the island.
There might be more terrestrial bird change too, but through vegetation management rather than seabird over time anyway.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the Twitchathon funding was for the seabirds, but yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I didn't actually cover in the talk, just thinking about it, is the habitat is just perfect there for things like thornbills and scrub wrens and fairy wrens. But they won't cross the ocean. And at Dark Point there are various honeyeaters, white-cheeked and New Holland and Lewins. They perhaps do cross the island, but they certainly don't stay. We've not got any records of them, even though they don't have very far to travel. So maybe the habitat's not quite right for those honeyeater species just yet.
All right. Thanks very much, Alan. A virtual mug.
Oh, I want a T-shirt.
Oh, on that topic, I'm happy to reserve a T-shirt for Alan.
Okay.
Since I'm in charge of getting, I might as well say now, there are, as of next month, you'll be able to order your own club T-shirt, polo shirt, or Sloppy Joe. So stay tuned.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz. I assume we'll update people on emails and things, and there'll be information on the website about that.
Yep.
Yep.